Soldiers' remains and a flight he was denied. What happened next shook the entire. The early morning air inside Dallas International Airport carried a sterile chill, the kind that settled deep into the bones. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed, casting an artificial glow on the polished floors. The terminal was alive with the quiet murmurs of weary travelers, the occasional ding of an announcement, and the rolling wheels of carry-on luggage moving across the tile. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Miller stood near the boarding gate, his posture as rigid as the uniform he wore. His presence, despite the bustle of the airport, commanded a silent kind of respect. The silver oak leaves on his shoulders marked his rank, but it was the flag-draped casket beside him that carried the real weight. Inside the casket lay Staff Sergeant Mark Rivers, a soldier who had given everything in a war fought on foreign soil. Miller had not known Rivers personally, but that didn't matter. The duty of escorting a fallen soldier home was one that transcended familiarity. It was sacred. It was a final promise that no man or woman in uniform would ever be left behind. Miller had performed this duty before. He knew the gravity of it. He knew that, when he finally reached Rivers' small hometown, he would meet parents who had been waiting for a homecoming that should have been filled with joy, not sorrow. He knew that, when the casket was lowered into the ground, a mother would clutch the folded flag to her chest, as if it could somehow replace the son she had lost. He had seen it all before, and yet, each time, it weighed on him just the same. As the time for boarding approached, Miller stepped forward, handing his ticket and military ID to the airline gate agent. The woman behind the counter barely glanced at him at first, her eyes fixed on the computer screen in front of her. Then, something changed. Her brows furrowed slightly. Her lips pressed together. She hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir," she said finally, her voice cool and detached. "You won't be able to board this flight." Miller's expression remained neutral, but inside, something tensed. He had faced enemy fire, had walked through war zones where every step could be his last. He had survived ambushes and seen men under his command take their final breaths. He had learned to read situations quickly, and right now, something about this one didn't sit right. "There must be some mistake," he said, his tone firm but composed. "I'm on an official military assignment." The woman glanced at the screen again, then back at him. "There's an issue with your reservation." Miller looked past her, watching as other passengers scanned their tickets and walked onto the plane without issue. His jaw clenched. "My ticket is confirmed. My paperwork is in order. What's the issue?" The woman averted her gaze. "It's just policy." That was when he knew. There was no real reason, no technical glitch, no missing documentation. This was something else entirely. Bureaucracy at its worst, an arbitrary roadblock that no one wanted to take responsibility for. The murmurs began behind him. Did she just deny him boarding? That guy's military, and he's with a casket. What the hell? Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Miller could hear the faint sound of a camera clicking into place. A few feet away, an older man stood up from his seat. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. The Marine Corps tattoo on his arm was faded, but unmistakable. "You've got to be kidding me," the older man muttered under his breath. He stepped forward, his boots hitting the tile with deliberate force. "You mind explaining why you're stopping this man?" he asked, his voice gruff with years of command. The gate agent didn't answer. The crowd around them began to grow, passengers pausing to watch the scene unfold. A younger man, holding his phone up to record, spoke up. "This is messed up. He's escorting a fallen soldier. How do you justify this?" More voices joined in. "This is disgraceful." Let him through! A woman nearby shook her head, visibly disgusted. Unbelievable. The airlines always talk about honoring the troops. But when it actually matters? The murmurs became a wave. By midday, the story had reached the Pentagon. Officials were making calls. Generals were demanding explanations. The airline's CEO was in an emergency meeting, scrambling to contain the disaster. But it was too late. By the time the airline issued a statement, a misunderstanding, an unfortunate situation, a regrettable miscommunication, it was clear that no amount of corporate spin could undo the damage. Their stock price plummeted. Veterans organizations called for a boycott. Passengers canceled flights in protest. The CEO of the airline stood before cameras, his face pale and tense. "We sincerely apologize," he said, his voice carefully measured. "This was never our intention." A journalist in the front row didn't let him off the hook. "Will you be compensating the family of the fallen soldier? Will you resign?" The CEO hesitated. There was no good answer. That evening, Miller boarded a private military plane. The Pentagon had intervened, ensuring he and Rivers made it home without further interference. When they arrived in Rivers' small hometown, it was just before sunset. The streets were lined with people, holding flags, standing in silent tribute. No cameras, no bureaucratic red tape, just respect. As the hearse moved through the town, Miller saw a mother standing at the front of the crowd. Rivers' mother. Tears streamed down her face, but she held herself upright, strong, proud. Miller saluted as the hearse passed. No one needed a boarding pass to honor a hero. No one needed permission to show respect. For the airline, the damage was irreversible. Their reputation was shattered. The boycott was relentless. Some mistakes could be fixed. This wasn't one of them. The night had already draped its dark veil over Washington, D.C., but inside the Pentagon, the lights never truly went out. In one of the secluded offices within the fortified structure, Colonel Jonathan Miller sat behind a heavy wooden desk. Before him lay a closed file, nearly devoid of any distinguishing marks. He had no idea why he had been summoned so urgently. But he knew one thing for certain. This was no routine meeting. Less than 2 weeks ago, his role had been straightforward: escorting the remains of a fallen soldier back home. But what should have been a solemn duty had spiraled into a national scandal when an airline denied him boarding, preventing him from completing the mission. The incident had sparked a media firestorm, leading to public outrage. The airline suffered catastrophic financial losses, executives resigned in disgrace, and the entire country bore witness to the humiliating spectacle. But what Miller couldn't understand was why he was being called in now, in the middle of the night, long after he thought the story had reached its conclusion. Across the desk sat a man with a severe expression. His head was completely shaved, and an old scar ran across his right cheek. Though he wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, Miller was certain this was no ordinary government bureaucrat. "Colonel Miller," the man spoke in a low, deliberate voice, laced with something unsettling. "What happened at the airport wasn't a coincidence." Miller remained silent, waiting for the man to continue. "There are things you don't know about Sergeant Mark Rivers." A cold sensation crept into Miller's gut. He had always known that behind every story lay deeper layers of truth. But the idea that there was a secret surrounding a fallen soldier was not something he had anticipated. The man slowly opened the file and slid out a grainy black-and-white surveillance photograph. It showed a figure in military uniform walking down a narrow corridor. The image was blurry, indistinct, but something about it felt off. This was taken one day before Rivers was officially declared dead. Miller studied the photograph carefully. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, after a moment, he saw it. The detail that sent a chill through him. This isn't Rivers. The man across from him closed the file and met Miller's gaze directly. Exactly. A heavy weight settled in Miller's stomach. The implications were clear, but they made no sense. If the man in the picture wasn't Mark Rivers, then who was he? And why had someone ensured that Rivers' remains were returned, if they even belonged to Rivers at all? Before Miller could voice another question, the door swung open. A second officer stepped inside, his face grim, his posture tense as if bracing for impact. "We have a problem," the officer said quietly. "Rivers' original file is gone." Miller turned back to the scarred man, whose expression remained unreadable, almost as if he had expected this development. This wasn't just a bureaucratic error. Someone wanted this story buried. And now, Miller was a part of it. Colonel Jonathan Miller was not a man easily shaken. He had seen war, faced death, and carried burdens that would break lesser men. But what he had just heard made his heart pound in a slow, heavy rhythm. Mark Rivers' original file had disappeared. In the world of military intelligence, files didn't just go missing. They were hidden. The bald man sitting across from him spoke, his voice calm but weighted with something unspoken. "Colonel Miller, you need to understand something. What happened at that airport wasn't just a bureaucratic mistake or an airline's foolish decision. Someone gave a direct order to keep you off that plane." Miller's expression didn't change, but a cold current of unease crept through his veins. "Why?" "Because there are people, somewhere, who didn't want Rivers to come home." Silence fell over the room like a heavy fog. The only sound was the steady hum of the air conditioning. Miller lowered his gaze to the photograph still resting on the table. The grainy image of the unknown man spotted a day before Rivers was declared dead. Nothing about this made sense. Finally, he spoke. "If that's true, then why send the body back at all? Why not just make him disappear over there?" The bald man exchanged a glance with the other officer, as if silently debating whether to reveal what came next. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, he answered, "Because someone forced them to send it." Miller's brow lifted slightly. "Who?" "We don't know." Miller exhaled sharply. The deeper he went into this, the more tangled it became. He had been played. This mission was never just about escorting a fallen soldier home. He was a pawn in a much larger game, one where he didn't even know the rules yet. He rose from his chair slowly, ignoring the way their eyes followed him. "I want to speak with Rivers' family." The second officer shook his head. "We tried. They're gone." Miller frowned. "Gone?" 3 days ago, his parents left their home in Ohio. No credit card transactions, no digital footprint, no sightings since. A chill slithered down Miller's spine. There was no doubt now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't military red tape. Someone, somewhere, was pulling strings, making sure the truth never surfaced. He took a step closer to the table, planting his hands firmly on its surface. "I need everything. Every report, every document, every recorded conversation about Rivers in the last 3 months." The bald man let out a long breath, then slowly shook his head. "If you go down this road, Colonel Miller, you need to understand one thing." Miller arched a brow, waiting. "You may not like what you find." Colonel Jonathan Miller stood by the window of his office, gazing at the scattered lights of Washington, D.C. The city never slept, just like the thoughts ricocheting through his mind. Everything about this case felt wrong, but he had yet to grasp just how dangerous the truth he was approaching truly was. Behind him, the bald officer and the other man who had delivered the bad news were waiting for his response. Miller turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "I want to start from the last confirmed sighting of Mark Rivers. Any report, any footage, any piece of information. I want everything." The bald officer retrieved a tablet from his briefcase, placing it on the desk in front of Miller. "This is the last surveillance footage of him, taken a day before his death was officially announced." Miller pressed play. The video was grainy, black and white, recorded from a high angle, likely inside a military facility. A soldier in uniform strode quickly down a narrow corridor, glancing around as if making sure he wasn't being watched. Miller narrowed his eyes. Something felt off. And then he froze. The man in the video wasn't Mark Rivers. Same height, same building, same military haircut. But it wasn't him. Miller was certain of it. "Who is this?" The bald officer hesitated, as if reluctant to answer. Then, after a brief silence, he spoke a single word. "We don't know." Miller stared at him for a long moment. "You're telling me we have someone impersonating Rivers, disappearing on the same day the real Rivers was declared dead? That's what it looks like." Miller felt a slow burn of anger rising inside him. "Then where was the real Rivers at the time this footage was taken?" "There's no record of him anywhere." Miller turned back to the screen, watching the video again. Something gnawed at him. The man in the footage wasn't panicked. He wasn't running. He walked with purpose, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Where is this hallway? An advanced operations base in Afghanistan. Miller's jaw tightened. Was anyone else from that base reported missing during that time frame? The bald officer exchanged glances with his colleague before tapping a few commands into his tablet. A list of names appeared. Miller scanned the first one, Lieutenant Jacob Stearns. He looked up. "Who is Jacob Stearns?" The officer exhaled slowly. "He was an intelligence officer stationed at the same base as Rivers. He vanished that same night. No trace of him since." A chill ran down Miller's spine. This was bigger than an identity mix-up. Someone was pulling the strings, and the unanswered questions were piling up fast. "All right. Where is his family?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "They disappeared too." Now, Miller understood. This wasn't a bureaucratic error. This wasn't just a missing soldier. Someone had deliberately erased these people. Miller clenched his fist. He needed answers. "I want to go to Afghanistan. I need to see this base for myself." The bald officer's expression remained impassive. "You know that won't be easy, right?" "Nothing about this case has been easy." The officer leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "What if I told you that someone doesn't want you to get there?" Miller turned his head slowly, his steel-gray eyes locking onto the man's. "Then that means I need to get there. Fast." Less than 24 hours later, Colonel Jonathan Miller was aboard a military cargo plane bound for an advanced operations base in Afghanistan. This was not an official trip, nor was he in any position to obtain direct authorization. But waiting was not an option. An old acquaintance, retired Colonel Ethan Corbett, had arranged a seat for him on the flight, in exchange for a simple promise: don't cause trouble. Miller already knew that was a promise he wouldn't be able to keep. The plane touched down at dawn. The air was unusually cold, a thin veil of mist clinging to the barren landscape. Miller stepped off the ramp without exchanging a word with the crew, his boots hitting the packed dirt of the base. Almost immediately, he found himself facing a group of soldiers, their expressions wary. One of them, a young captain with sharp eyes and a rigid stance, approached. "Colonel Miller, we weren't expecting visitors today." Miller pulled out his military ID and handed it over. "I won't be here long, just need a few answers." The captain examined the ID before handing it back. "Answers about what, exactly?" Miller didn't respond right away. Instead, he let his gaze sweep over the base. This was the last known location of Mark Rivers and Jacob Stearns before they vanished. Something happened here, and he intended to find out what. "I need access to the surveillance room," he said finally. "I want to see the footage from the night they disappeared." The captain hesitated. "I'll need clearance for that." Miller took a step closer, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. "The only thing you need to do is take me there. Now." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, the captain turned and gestured for Miller to follow. The surveillance room was small, filled with monitors, cables, and the stale scent of cold coffee. A fatigued operations officer sat behind the main console, straightening up the moment Miller walked in. "I need the footage from the night Jacob Stearns disappeared, and Mark Rivers was declared dead." The officer hesitated before tapping a few keys. Within moments, a series of grainy black and white clips appeared on the screen. Miller focused on the first video. It showed the same hallway he had seen before, but this time there was something new. Jacob Stearns was there, and he wasn't alone. He was walking beside the unknown man, the one who had been mistaken for Mark Rivers. "Stop there," Miller ordered. The footage froze. Stearns was speaking to the other man, but there was no audio. "Is there a sound recording?" The officer shook his head. The microphones were disabled that night. A sharp, cold sensation settled in Miller's gut. Who disabled them? The officer hesitated again. "There's no record of that." Miller clenched his jaw. This wasn't an accident. Someone had ensured that no one could hear what was being said that night. In the next frame, the unknown man was leading Stearns out of view, toward a blind spot in the surveillance coverage. Where were they going? The officer ran another search, his voice quieter when he responded. "To the old supply depot." Miller turned sharply toward the captain. "Take me there." The supply depot was at the far edge of the base, a forgotten structure that had seen better days. The metal door was secured with a rusted chain. Miller reached for it, testing the lock. It wasn't tightly fastened. He exchanged a glance with the captain before yanking it free. The door creaked open. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dust-covered crates and shelves stacked with discarded equipment. The air smelled of neglect. Then something caught his eye. Footprints, faint but visible in the dust, leading toward a specific corner of the room. Miller followed them carefully. He crouched, brushing away a layer of dirt, revealing a small metal box. He lifted the lid and froze. Inside was a torn piece of military fabric, a uniform sleeve. Dried blood stained the fabric. Miller exhaled slowly, gripping the cloth tightly. This belonged to Stearns. Before he could speak, a sound came from behind him. A footstep. Miller spun around, instinctively pushing the captain aside and drawing his sidearm. A figure stood in the doorway, partially obscured by shadows. Then the figure stepped forward, and the flashlight beam illuminated his face. Miller's breath caught in his throat. It was Jacob Stearns, and he was very much alive. The silence was electric. Colonel Miller stood frozen, his eyes locked on the man who was supposed to be dead. Jacob Stearns was not a corpse, not just another name on the list of the missing. He was here, standing right in front of him, his eyes burning with something Miller couldn't quite define. Anger? Fear? Or both? The captain raised his weapon. But he never got the chance to act before Stearns lifted a hand and spoke in a quiet yet razor-sharp voice. "If you want to get out of here alive, lower your weapon. Now." Miller didn't move, but he gave the captain a subtle signal to stand down. He wanted answers, and this man was the only one who could give them to him. Stearns stepped further into the supply room, his eyes scanning the space as if checking for hidden dangers. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with something that sounded like deep exhaustion. "You weren't supposed to make it this far, Miller." Miller kept his gaze steady. "Well, I'm here now, so how about you tell me? What the hell is going on?" Stearns let out a short, humorless laugh. "What's going on? The truth is, Mark Rivers was never supposed to come home. And now, you've ruined everything." Miller's grip on his weapon tightened, though he kept it lowered. "Is he really dead? Or is that just another lie?" Stearns looked him dead in the eye. "Mark Rivers died months ago, but not in combat, like they told everyone." A chill ran down Miller's spine. Then how did he die? Stearns exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. He found out something he wasn't supposed to know. Something about operations that weren't official. Miller's jaw tightened. Operations like what? Black ops. The kind that don't exist in any official record. The kind no one admits to. But he was there. He saw things he wasn't meant to see. The pieces started falling into place. So they got rid of him. Stearns gave a slow nod. But they couldn't just have him disappear. The story had to be clean. A battle. Honor. A flag-draped coffin. Miller clenched his teeth. Who gave the order? Stearns was silent for a long second before answering. It came from the highest levels. Miller felt his pulse quicken. Highest levels? Are we talking Pentagon? Intelligence? Who? But Stearns didn't answer. Instead, his eyes suddenly shifted behind Miller, as if he had heard something. Something Miller hadn't. Then, a gunshot rang out. Miller barely managed to throw himself aside as the bullet shattered a wooden crate behind him, sending splinters flying. At the same time, Stearns moved, vanishing into the shadows like he had expected this all along. "Ambush!" the captain shouted, drawing his weapon as the sound of rushing footsteps filled the air outside. Miller dove behind cover, his pistol already in hand. He had no idea who was attacking them, but he had a damn good guess. It was the same people who wanted this story buried. More gunfire erupted. They were outnumbered, and Miller knew that staying here meant dying. He turned to the captain. "We need to move." But before they could, the back door of the supply room burst open. For a brief moment, Miller thought they were done for. But the person standing there wasn't one of the attackers. It was Stearns, and he tossed something small into the room. A smoke grenade. "Follow me if you want to live." Miller didn't have a choice. As the smoke exploded around them, he sprinted forward, the captain right behind him. 2 hours later, they were miles away from the base, hidden in an abandoned structure. Stearns had led them to a remote hideout, far from any prying eyes. Miller sat on a metal crate, trying to process what had just happened. "Now," he said, his voice sharp, "are you going to tell me why you saved us?" Stearns wiped sweat from his brow before looking Miller dead in the eye. "Because I need your help, Miller." Miller narrowed his eyes. "Help with what?" "Uncovering the truth, and taking down the people who killed Mark Rivers, and who will now try to kill you, too." Miller didn't speak, but he knew one thing for certain. He had crossed a line he could never return from.